I'm Alex Koch here, and I'm a reporter with TYT Investigates. I specialize in all kinds of money in politics, including quite often money coming from Charles and David Koch, the billionaire industrialist brothers who run Koch Industries and are known as prolific Republican political donors. So their influence not only expands to direct political expenditures, to think tanks and political advocacy groups, but also, and in my estimation, most importantly, to their agenda, to higher education institutions. News broke a couple weeks ago because of freedom of information requests by an alumna of George Mason University and by the group Unkoch My Campus and its GMU affiliate, Transparent GMU, that there were several donor agreements that the Charles Koch Foundation had gotten involved with GMU that were kind of contrary to GMU's codes of conduct in terms of sort of donor policy and donor influence over the economics department, and in particular several kind of on-campus think tanks like the Mercatus Center in that department. Also revealed were a trove of emails between the dean of the GMU Law School, Henry Butler, and ranking members of the Federalist Society, which is a quite conservative, large and powerful network of lawyers and in some cases justices around the country. The Federalist Society and the Charles Koch Foundation teamed up in 2016 to give $30 million to the law school in order to rename it after the late conservative Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, as well as provide money for a considerable number of scholarships to the law school. And we recently, I guess I would say last fall, early fall, late summer, BuzzFeed unearthed the fact that there was a nonprofit called the BH Fund that was administering the $20 million donation, which actually came from a friend of Leonard Leo, who Leonard Leo is really the face of the Federalist Society, and he's their executive vice president. So an anonymous donor who was friends with Leo approached Leo and asked him if he could steward that money to George Mason in order to name the law school after his close friend, Antonin Scalia, who died a couple years ago. So we found out that the BH Fund was on the memorandum of understanding of this agreement, and that fund was the one stewarding the money. Now, a short search into sort of Virginia corporation records shows that Leo and another fairly high-ranking administrator at the Federal Society named Jonathan Bunch were the two executives of the BH Fund, and therefore were making decisions about that money and stewarding that money on behalf of the anonymous donor. So what we found through a trove of emails that GMU law alumna Allison Pienta has discovered from this Freedom of Information Act request was that Leo was often corresponding with Butler, the dean of the law school, about various hiring decisions. Butler was consulting Leo about a 5-year plan for the university. He was sending him yearly updates and sort of to inform him how the grant money was being spent and how it's going. And it turns out that a lot of the scholarship money that it turns into university revenue when it's used for the scholarships is then being sent over to a couple ideological centers within the law school, one of which is called the Center for the Study of the Administrative State, which a current Trump appointee, Naomi Rao, member of the Trump administration currently, was the first director of. So there's a lot there. You can see the link to the article in the comments of this live stream here. So I actually haven't been to it yet, and I'm going to go to it right now for the first time. So I encourage you as well. You can kind of read along with that. There's all the juicy details, all the connections between several professors that we identified as having been hired after the grant was cemented. In fact, there are 10 professors who were hired after the grant who have links to the Federalist Society. 7 of them had these links before being hired. And that's out of a total of 15 that I identified have been hired since the grant agreement. So that's a significant number of connections to the group that was shepherding this $20 million donation. And that raises questions about academic freedom, the ideological bent of the department, and how it's going to move forward as a law school. I'll give you some more details about these professors that I identified. Three of them are particularly close to the Federalist Society. We have someone who was a good friend of Leonard Leo. According to Henry Butler, she was a good friend. They were communicating about her hiring over email, as these documents show. She also routinely participates in Federalist Society events. She speaks on panels, she gives lectures at the Federalist Society events. There's another professor who, according to the last financial record, 2015, the tax statement of a particular conservative nonprofit, this professor was sharing a seat on the board of that nonprofit with Leonard Leo. So they're, close confidants in the nonprofit sector. And also another professor who was listed a few years ago as an annual donor to the Federalist Society. So these are important connections to make, considering that they were hired after this donation was made to the law school. And a lot of people are speaking up. The faculty senate at GMU has not fully addressed the issue yet. They addressed the Charles Koch Foundation issue, and they made some serious proposals to the administration for all of the donor agreements to be made public. And this is a key thing. George Mason is a public university, but most of the donation money goes through the GMU Foundation, which is considered a separate entity and not a public entity. So that's a way for donors to hide their identity, for the school to hide the donors they don't want to make public, and the stipulations of those agreements, which some have found to be fairly generous towards the donor and to risk academic freedom by giving the donors certain say over hiring decisions, even over potential coursework or academics that are, that they're linked to. If you're reading through the document, looks like we've got a great graphic here. The two Koch brothers, Charles and David, in front of the law school. And they've been donating, I should say, to George Mason since at least the early 1980s, if not before. And George Mason is the #1 school recipient of Charles Koch Foundation money of all schools in the country. And we're talking about 400 colleges and universities that the Koch Foundation has donated to over the last several decades. So I'm going to answer this first question here. So I'm just going to read the question so everyone can kind of hear what I'm responding to. GMU Law School is known as Koch U. I've seen this in Dave Leventhal's reporting for Center for Public Integrity. Other people have followed suit calling it Koch U, and that's because they've gotten tens of millions of dollars a year at this point from the Charles Koch Foundation, mainly for these economics programs I mentioned earlier. The college I went to is known for being very liberal. This is Wesleyan University, the questioner is saying. And in fact, there was a movie made by fellow graduates called PCU, as in politically correct U. Sounds like conservatives are pooling their money to create a conservative law school. How is this different? Okay, so what's different about this is you have a lot of donors all around the country. Universities, private and public, are always fundraising. I'm sure everyone listening knows this. And public universities especially are pretty squeezed right now with state budget cuts. And George Mason, I should say, is a public university. And they're certainly squeezed financially. So they're kind of, they're looking for money wherever they can get it. The difference between this donation from the Federalist Society and the Charles Koch Foundation and many other Charles Koch Foundation donations and more kind of typical donations is that these are very laser focused on particular ideological agenda, mainly free market economics, deregulation, things that sort of right-wing conservatives believe in, certainly things that the Koch brothers, who are libertarian, have always believed in and are very passionate about. And so, instead of giving money to a general fund of a university or even to a particular school or department and saying, here's the money, we support what you're doing, do what you like with it, or even, hire an endowed chair named after the donor, that's standard stuff. But for the donor to actually stipulate in the grant agreement that, for instance, this is how this $30 million donation was set up. You can, once a year, the donor or the representatives of the donor have to, approve what's happening. And if they don't, they can pull the funding. So instead of a one-time $30 million gift, I think at least in terms of the $20 million given by the Federalist Society, the anonymous donor via the Federalist Society, that's a 5-year plan where they're dispersing $4 million each year over 5 years, and they can decide to cut off the funds if they don't like what's happening at the law school. So that's, I mean, that's a significant difference. This isn't to say that there aren't other donors, liberal or conservative, who are trying to control, to some degree, the donations that they've given. But in my research, it's pretty safe to say that the Kochs are definitely stick out enormously for their attempts at as much donor control as possible, because they have a political agenda. I mean, this is not just so they can train young aspiring lawyers to be conservative. I mean, it's a pipeline into not only the judiciary, but into politics. I mean, a lot of politicians have law degrees, and it's also a talent pipeline into the Koch sort of think tank and political advocacy network. Places like the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, nonprofit groups that advocate for conservative political causes, like Americans for Prosperity, which is probably the Koch brothers' most publicly well-known political nonprofit. I'm going to go into another question here. Randy Hopewell says, yell as loud as you can while ripping out all the pages in the books behind you. Yeah, I mean, this can get people pretty worked up. What is your feeling about how the Koch brothers' practice impacts academic freedom? So I think I've gotten a little into this, but to be more specific, you know, when you have private donors donating to a college, especially a public college, which state taxpayers are subsidizing, and these colleges are purportedly meant to teach all people of all walks of life, of all ideologies, and they're supposed to teach these people a wide range of views around various subjects. When you have a private donor going in there and dictating, or at least being on a committee of people who approve faculty hires, in the case of some of these previous Charles Koch Foundation memoranda, if you have Leonard Leo communicating on a regular basis with Henry Butler about who's a potential interviewee for some of these faculty hires, and by the way, they hired 12 people since at least 12 people since the donor agreement was cemented. So this is a large influx of faculty, many of whom have been recommended or approved by Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society, and hired by Henry Butler, who has ties to Leo and the Kochs, as I've said. You know, you're really impacting the curricula, not only the curricula of the courses, but the very courses that these professors choose to teach. Then you're impacting the research that's coming out of the university, that can be cited in cases, that can be cited in the congressional record under deliberations over laws, prospective laws. I mean, this is why. I mean, this is not chump change. This is $30 million, and it's also on top of years of donations from Charles Koch Foundation already. So they're not doing this out of the good of their hearts. They're doing it because they have a political agenda. The Federalist Society is known now most famously for helping shepherd Neil Gorsuch into the Supreme Court. And Neil Gorsuch was on a list of recommended nominees by the Federalist Society to the Trump administration. And then once Gorsuch was the nominee, they helped get him the votes in the Senate to become the conservative justice on the court, the most latest one, and in fact, occupying the seat that Obama deserved to fill with Merrick Garland, but Mitch McConnell in the Senate blocked that nomination for a year. So I'm going to go into the next question. Lee Allen Meyer says, Dark Money by Jane Mayer. By the way, Jane Mayer is the award-winning investigative reporter for The New Yorker, and I highly recommend the book Dark Money. It came out in 2016. So this book by Mayer and Democracy and Change by Nancy McLean. She's also a wonderful scholar on conservative philanthropy. She has a new book, Democracy and Change, that's excellent as well. I have a copy of it sitting on my bedside table, I believe. I'm currently working my way through it. I'm sorry, Nancy, for not finishing it yet. So these are two great books regarding this issue. Lee Allen Meyer is saying, yeah, and that's absolutely true. Just on a personal note, Jane Mayer is the journalist I most look up to. I'm really inspired by her work, and I learn a lot from her work. So I encourage you to read her book, of course, Dark Money, but also check out her articles at The New Yorker. They're consistently bombshell articles with months of reporting behind them. Actually, most lately, she and Ronan Farrow recently broke the story about Eric Schneiderman sexual misconduct allegations, and that was a major story that obviously she worked on. I couldn't recommend them more. Dark money starts out in way back in the early 20th century and maps out sort of the predecessors to the Koch brothers. Some families like the Scaife family, the Searle family, the Bradley family, who are also now very wealthy conservative families who have had foundations through a couple generations that also give to a lot of the same causes, and even in fact sometimes universities that the Charles Koch Foundation donates to. And I should also say that the Kochs are very connected to the Federalist Society. They did not exactly have an introduction recently. They've been donating to the Federalist Society for some time, considerable amounts of money. And I would imagine they agree with a lot of the Federalist Society's choices or preferences for judicial nominations, because they too, the Federalist Society as well, is definitely kind of on the right wing in favor of less regulation and lower taxation. One point of the article that I think is key and has been debated is whether the administrators of the law school are using the money as they initially stipulated. So what Dean Butler, what Provost Wu said initially when announcing the agreement was that the $30 million would fund scholarships only. It would only go towards scholarships. And then there would be the law school itself from its existing fund would pay to hire 12 more professors, and would also provide sort of an unspecified amount of support for a couple of these law school centers that I mentioned. And what ended up happening was, I guess the scholarship money comes back to the school as revenue, and then they can use that money to fund these centers, like the Center for the Study of the Administrative State. So that's, in a way, kind of, I guess, illustrating, how this money can not only attract more students to the law school, and they've actually been having a real dip in applications and in matriculations, which is a problem for a school when you're low on money and you have less people paying money. How are you going to maintain your programs? Well, it seems a little weird that you have a department or a law school rather that's lost I think around 20-25% of its students over the last few years, and then it's going to hire 12 more professors. That seems sort of counterintuitive, but it appears that they had the money somewhere, or they're also using money from the scholarship revenue in order to hire all these more professors. Most departments would, if they have a shortage in applications, they're not going to hire 12 more professors. They're going to work on the applications and then perhaps hire more if they need to. But as you can see, this is another reason why these donations from sort of politically polarizing people like Charles Koch, like Leonard Leo, like the Federalist Society, and whoever this anonymous donor was, can really impinge on academic freedom, because without the money, they wouldn't be hiring these professors at all. And the ratio of professors hired under this agreement, stewarded by these donors, would be much different. So there's been a long relationship between the Federalist Society and law students and young justices. But I think things like this allow powerful, moneyed interests to kind of sway the academic discourse of a school to produce this talent pipeline I've mentioned. Out of a public university, which I think a lot of people in academic ethics would say is crossing a line. So one question I've had in the past is that do we think that with the Koch money coming in, is it a perception that academia is inhospitable to various academic ideas on the left or the right? And it really depends on which area of academics you're talking about. If you're talking about the liberal arts, humanities, these are going to be, professors are going to lean liberal. That's just how it is. Academics in various departments do tend to lean liberal. If you're in engineering, for example, you might find more conservative faculty. In law schools, I do think the professors lean liberal, but I don't believe that they are as liberal overall as say English or women's studies. But I do think that the donors like the Kochs and like the Federal Society do think that there is a discrepancy, and so they feel they have the right to correct this. The problem with that is, universities hire who they want, and people go into academia if they would like to, and they could, they can afford a graduate degree to qualify for it. And, private donors coming in there and manipulating the political leaning of the people who are hired by these public universities is artificially changing the ideological bent. And that's not to say that a conservative professor is only going to teach conservative things and a liberal professor is only going to teach, liberal authors. That's not true. But when you have money coming from people who have proven themselves to be extremely partisan, who are helping influence these hiring decisions, who are picking people or helping pick people who they know will essentially promote the ideas that they believe in. That's when you're getting into a pretty, at least a gray area of academic integrity, if not really a violation of academic freedom. So I'm just going to check if there are any more questions, and then I think I'm going to wrap it up. Again, feel free to check out my article. It's here in the comments. Please follow us it's at TYT Investigates on Twitter, and follow me. It's at Alex Koch. That's ALEXKOTCH. We've got a lot of good stuff coming out at TYT Investigates. We've got Ken Klippenstein. We got Michael Tracy. And we're going to keep churning out the investigative scoops for you. I think I might have just one more question, so I'm going to respond to this, and then I have to go. Professors can have tremendous impact. I assume there's no word there. Tremendous impact on young people. If students are raised conservative, seek out this law school, does that make it okay that their professors have a big money-funded agenda? I don't think it matters what ideology the student is. I think when you go to a school, especially a public school, what you're paying for and what you're supposed to be getting is a balanced education, an education that covers the basis of what's within sort of the academic sphere of what you're studying. So if you have more conservative professors than liberal professors, that also shouldn't matter. But when you have private donors influencing the process, I think that's when things get murky. If I was, whatever, say I'm a leftist, or say I'm a right winger and I go to school, I don't want to just learn things that I agree with or learn things that are in line with sort of my political beliefs. I want to get the full scope of the academic scholarly work out there, and I can interpret it how I like. But I don't want to go somewhere where you have, all the professors or many of the professors are linked to the very donors who are essentially paying their salaries. And I think that's about it for now. I hope to do this again soon, live on Facebook for TYT. Follow our work, and stay tuned for more Koch and Federal Society scoops as we go forward.